Oh, how the mighty fall. The Terminator franchise has joined the ranks amongst franchises who keep producing movies that add nothing to the franchise and actively take away from its original films that made everyone love the franchise in the first place. Genesis retroactively wrote T1 and T2 out of canon, and while Dark Fate did perform a soft reboot, restoring the original 2 to canon and only writing Rise of the Machines on out, it has essentially made T1 and T2 useless. But before I jump into that rant, I'm going to talk non-spoiler stuff about the film and say what good things I can about the movie. If this movie were to come out completely independently of any IP, I'd say it was your typical meh, flashy Hollywood action flick. The pacing was actually okay, it didn't feel overly long or ridiculously rushed. The effects were mostly good, but I got some serious Rubber Neo flashbacks from certain shots of that Terminator. Holy The action scenes are fine. I think the opening one in the factory was probably the best. They have decent choreography and it's all very high energy and fun to look at. But then the movie falls into that typical Hollywood trap of bigger things to explode means higher stakes. We were in a car chase, so what's next? A helicopter? The helicopter exploded. Let's get a military airplane. When movies fall into this mindset where only the size of the explosion or the amount of guns being shot or the number of ships in a battle adds to the stakes compared to the previous fights, the action starts to feel repetitive and boring and often leaves the audience feeling empty because it's just a hollow attempt at making people care. The performances in the movie range from decentish to fine. Mackenzie Davis as Grace probably does the best job, and bless her, she's trying to carry this movie on her back, and to her credit, she's pretty much the only reason I enjoyed anything about the film, and I guess seeing Linda Hamilton as Sarah Connor was nice despite it being really shallow in the context of the film. Even Natalia Reyes would have been fine, except for the fact that her character, who is supposed to be the main character, is the least interesting and blandest of the three mains. This is a pretty small and insignificant note, but I really liked the design and concept for Grace, in particular reference to her medical scars. It would have been really easy when starting with the concept of a super soldier to go overboard, but instead she had these subtle but instantly identifiable scar patterns that I thought added a lot. And the idea of a super soldier that still has biological human limitations with how much energy they can expend within a given time, I thought was a really good spin on the super soldier idea and gave a drawback to otherwise OP abilities. Unfortunately, the movie doesn't really utilize this concept as well as it could have, and it only became an issue when convenient. But I'm going to give credit for the idea, I just wish they'd done more with it. And now we get into the juicy spoilers and my ranting. The biggest issue with this movie is that it is a terrible Terminator movie because it makes T1 and T2 completely useless. It almost doesn't matter that they bombed Genesis out of existence because this film may as well have done the same thing Genesis did. The whole point of the original two movies was that John Connor was the man who would lead humanity to victory over the machines. But if they could stop that from happening, there'd be no war and no end of humanity. If Sarah and John and the T-800 stopped Judgment Day, humanity would be saved. Except not really, because turns out another apocalypse with the exact same premise and outcome was going to happen anyways. So the fact that Judgment Day was stopped doesn't matter because Judgment Day 2.0 was going to happen anyways, but this time with a different cast of characters. This supposedly completely different not Skynet thing that's called Legion, but I will only ever refer to it as not Skynet, still takes over the world, still systematically wipes out almost all of humanity, still results in a budding human resistance, still results in them sending a Terminator to try and kill the resistance leader. I mean, for sake, not Skynet still uses Terminators that look exactly like the Terminators used by Skynet. Would have been too damaging to marketing to have a new design, huh? It doesn't matter that not Skynet didn't launch nukes and instead just starved humanity out. It doesn't matter that they sent back a Terminator to go straight for the kill on the savior character instead of her mother. The outcomes of this supposedly new scenario are identical and put the characters that we've cared about and loved back at square one and made them useless to this new future. They murk John Connor at the beginning so that they could have a new hero rise, but if a new hero could rise, that completely makes the importance of John Connor in the first two films useless. And this movie had like a sequel bait at the end implying Danny and Sarah were going to prevent Judgment Day 2.0, but why do I care that they stopped Judgment Day 2 when we could just end up having an identical Judgment Day 3 with an even blander, less interesting new savior of humanity? But instead of nukes or mass starvation, not Skynet 2 engineers a biological bomb that turns the majority of humanity into zombies, and in Future 3, the characters have to fight zombies and and the still identical Terminators. That part is very important. Dark Fate is a retroactive writing bomb that wipes out everything important from the first films. This film messed up with its basic premise, and it wouldn't have mattered how well executed everything else in this movie was. The premise was a fundamentally terrible choice for this franchise. And even then, this isn't exactly an otherwise stellarly executed film. Like I mentioned before, kinda has your standard action film plot, or really more a basic horror film plot in the sense of running away from a monster the whole runtime until a final face-off, but with big explosion, flashy action sequences, and little moments of fan service from the original films. A few questions that I still have and plot holes and errors that I want to point out and mention. Why on earth would Dani send back the girl that she took on as an adoptive daughter and raised back in time to die for her? I mean, when John Connor did it with his dad, he kind of had to, because John Connor needed to be created and only John Connor's dad could do that. But Dani instead just knowingly sent this girl who she considers family to die for her. The only argument I can think of for this is motivation, like Grace dying would motivate Dani to stop her Judgment Day, but I think the doom of humanity would have motivated anyone to try and stop what they knew to be Judgment Day, not just their child dying for them. Or on the flip side, the thought was sending Grace back to protect Dani would make Grace more motivated to protect her, but if that's the case, then Dani is a cold, manipulative who just used the girl she raised as a chess piece in the war. I cannot imagine ever sending someone I loved back in time to die for me unless it was completely necessary, like it was for John Connor. But as far as I can tell, Dani had other options in the form of other super soldiers and then still sent the girl she raised. Imagine being that much of a Those surgical modifications made to Grace looked seriously complicated, and I don't believe for a second that she was the first to undergo it, and there's nothing in the movie to suggest she was the first and only. I'm certain there were others. The explanation behind how Sarah Connor found Dani and Grace on the bridge makes zero sense. Blessed Carl said that he had picked up on disturbances in the time continuum or some science fiction mumbo jumbo, and would send Sarah the location where a Terminator would spawn and then she would kill it. She even said herself she got 2 coordinates from Mexico City, referring to where Grace popped in and where the Terminator did. But she wasn't there, because if she was, she would have performed a mercy for the audience and killed Grace instantly, and the movie would be over in the first 2 minutes. Meaning it still doesn't make any sense how she was able to find the 2 of them on the bridge. She just shows up to look cool and badass, which I superficially can appreciate, but that doesn't make it make any more sense. On a similar note, if Sarah had shown up to kill the Terminator when it landed, Sarah would have been dead, because we already saw that her typical methods of Terminator killing didn't work for this model of Terminator. It's all just a contrived plotline to make something happen while ignoring its own rules and logic put in place. They needed the movie to happen, and they somehow created an explanation that actively contradicted itself in the process. Later in the film, Sarah also had no reason to automatically assume that Blessed Carl was the Terminator that killed John when she well knew that several Terminators, all of the same model, can be sent back at the same or different times, and not all of them are a threat. That's kind of what the entire plot of T2 revolves around. But yeah, it happens to be the Terminator that killed John, because of course it is, and Sarah had to learn to not be vengeful, and people or machines can change, I guess. And I thought that we were actually going to have a movie show us a training sequence for a main character to learn an important skill relevant to the plot in the shooting range scene with Dani. It's been a massive problem in a lot of popular movies lately where characters can just do things because they can, no training or practice required. But instead, she starts and she's pretty bad at shooting, and I'm like, okay, great, we'll get to see her build up some skill and learn, and then she can be more useful in later fights. And then all that is immediately squashed down the drain when Sarah just whispers in her ear to imagine that a Terminator just killed her own family, and suddenly she has the shooting skills of a human aimbot. I'm well aware that people, especially when emotionally charged or pumped up on adrenaline, can do a lot of crazy things that they or a normal person normally wouldn't, but what a cheap cop-out to justify the acquisition of a skill. Sarah whispering that in her ear does not make her or anyone a perfect shot in the matter of seconds. That's completely ridiculous. Sarah herself spent years training and preparing herself to become as good of a fighter as she was. She didn't just magically become badass by telling herself to imagine a Terminator was after John. Certainly that was her motivation to train as hard as she did, but the key thing here is she still had to train. The movie thought it was being super clever by having Danny actually be Jesus instead of Mary, but I saw that coming a mile away. I specifically knew when Sarah was like, let me guess, her son saves humanity? And I was like, why use the gender specific term when the gender neutral one would have been fine? And then I realized that this movie was going to pull the gender bait and switch. And to be clear, this movie doesn't really directly mention gender or anything like that. It only exists in a couple of scenes, like how I mentioned above in the subtext. It's not some feminist the future is female propaganda or anything like that. I was also clued in when Danny never asked a single question about her fake baby. Not one. Never gave it a thought. She just accepted that her womb would house the hero of humanity and moved on. Though, as I talked about earlier, Danny clearly doesn't really care about her loved ones, or at least her children, adoptive or otherwise, that much, so maybe this is actually very in character for her. During that scene where the Terminator is hacking into the data network and the camera shows the train going straight to whatever Texas town it is that they're trying to get to, I already forgot. That doesn't make sense because the train never actually goes there. It stops somewhere near the border, and then Danny's uncle takes them God knows how far away to actually cross the border, but of course we needed the plot and the cool action scenes, so the Terminator just knew where they were going for absolutely no reason. Also, the Terminator just walks up to two Texas Rangers after that whole sequence in a Border Patrol officer outfit and casually asks for access to a helicopter and presumably got it somehow, because the next time we see him is in a helicopter barreling towards the gang. What on earth was that? If you haven't caught on to what I'm saying yet, this movie makes no sense. In a comparison to Genesis, its basic plot is a lot simpler and easier to follow, but the details and digging in any further than that leaves this movie's script an utter nightmare. If I can say anything else positive, I can say I liked Blessed Carl. The funniest joke in the whole movie was listening to him give Danny a detailed explanation on the importance of curtains to interior design. I would have rather the whole movie been about Carl learning to become more human while you have a vengeful Sarah Connor tracking him down for killing John. That could have been a great movie that wouldn't have messed with anything in the franchise. Instead, we got this. As far as what's next for the franchise, despite this movie setting it up, Dark Fate has seriously underperformed at the box office and I doubt we're going to get a sequel out of it. But to reiterate, this movie has already made me not care about any potential sequel. They've written themselves into the corner. At this point, I think they just need to leave the franchise alone, at least for a little while. I can only recommend this movie if you're really into flashy action flicks or just love any of the main cast. Otherwise, I would avoid this, especially as a fan of the Terminator franchise. It is just not worth seeing. It messes up way too much to justify. That's about all I have to say about the movie, but of course I want to know what you guys thought. Feel free to start a discussion below, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.